Can faith and intellect truly go hand in hand, or are they destined to be at odds? Throughout history, great minds have wrestled with this very question, searching for meaning beyond logic and reason. But what if the answer isn't as simple as we think? Join me as we dive into a compelling story that challenges our perspectives and reveals a surprising truth. Let's uncover the connection between belief and knowledge, because sometimes the most profound wisdom lies where we least expect it. The grand auditorium at one of America's most prestigious universities buzzed with anticipation. The annual Intellect and the Future of Society conference had always been a forum for the brightest minds to exchange ideas, but this year the excitement reached a new level. The presence of Vice President J.D. Vance as a keynote speaker had drawn an unprecedented crowd. Students, scholars, and intellectuals from across the country filled the hall, eager to hear from the man whose journey from a troubled childhood in Rust Belt America to the halls of power had become an inspiration to many. For some attendees, however, J.D. Vance's reputation was a source of skepticism rather than admiration. Many in elite academic circles viewed his strong Christian faith as an anachronism, incompatible with modern intellectual thought. Some whispered that his rise was more a product of political convenience than genuine intellect. Others simply doubted that a man of faith could hold his own in a room filled with scholars who prided themselves on their secular, scientific worldview. Among those eager to challenge the vice president was Professor Jonathan Pierce, a renowned intellectual and an outspoken critic of religion. A staunch atheist, Pierce had built his career on deconstructing faith-based beliefs and advocating for a purely rationalistic approach to human progress. His lectures were famous, or infamous, depending on whom you asked, for their scathing critiques of traditional values. To him, the presence of J.D. Vance at this event was an opportunity to expose what he saw as the fundamental contradiction between faith and reason. As the vice president took the stage, a mix of applause and murmurs swept through the audience. J.D. Vance, calm and composed, acknowledged the crowd with a steady gaze. He was well aware of the skepticism in the room, and he welcomed it. He had faced challenges far greater than this. But as he prepared to speak, he noticed Professor Pierce leaning back in his chair with a smirk, arms crossed, an unmistakable sign that a confrontation was imminent. What began as an academic discussion was about to turn into an intellectual battleground, one where J.D. Vance would be forced to defend not only his faith, but also the very idea that belief and reason could coexist. As the auditorium settled into a hushed anticipation, Professor Jonathan Pierce rose from his seat, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He strode toward the podium with the confidence of a man who had spent decades sharpening his rhetoric against what he deemed the outdated and irrational notions of faith. This was his domain, a world of logic, data, and scientific absolutism, and he was ready to make an example of the Vice President of the United States. "Ladies and gentlemen," Pierce began, his voice smooth yet edged with contempt, "we live in an age of unparalleled scientific discovery. We have decoded the human genome, probed the depths of the cosmos, and harnessed the very building blocks of life itself. And yet," he paused, casting a deliberate glance toward J.D. Vance, "some still cling to ancient superstitions as if they have any place in the modern intellectual arena." Pierce paced the stage, gesturing dramatically. "Let's address the elephant in the room," he said, turning back toward the audience. "Our distinguished guest, the Vice President of the United States, is a man of faith, a man who believes in miracles, divine intervention, and, let's be honest, a worldview that is fundamentally at odds with science." "Now, I don't blame him," Pierce continued, feigning sympathy. "Many intelligent people have struggled to free themselves from the shackles of religious dogma. It is not an easy journey." A ripple of laughter spread through the auditorium. Some students nodded in agreement, while others leaned forward, their eyes flicking between the professor and the vice president. It was clear that Pierce wasn't just challenging Vance, he was mocking him. "But here's what I find most fascinating," Pierce went on, his voice growing sharper. "For all the technological marvels we have at our fingertips, we still have leaders in positions of immense power who—" He paused for effect, turning to face J.D. Vance directly. believe in an invisible deity controlling the universe. Silence. A moment of dramatic tension filled the air, then Pierce struck. "Tell me, Mr. Vice President," he said, his voice dripping with theatrical condescension, "how do you reconcile your belief in an all-powerful God with the fact that science has systematically eroded every religious explanation ever put forth? We no longer need gods to explain lightning, disease, or the movement of the stars, and yet here you are, one of the most powerful men in the world, still insisting that faith and reason can coexist." The professor folded his arms, leaning against the podium with a self-assured smirk. He had delivered this speech before, dismantling countless religious students and conservative thinkers in debate halls across the country. He had seen it all: stammering defenses, awkward attempts to justify contradictions, emotional appeals that crumbled under scrutiny. He was ready for Vance to falter, but J.D. Vance did not falter. He did not shift uncomfortably in his seat. He did not lower his gaze or force a nervous chuckle. Instead, he sat perfectly still, his face calm, his eyes locked onto Pierce with unwavering focus. A murmur spread through the audience. Something about Vance's stillness unsettled them. The usual pattern was missing, the moment where the believer floundered, grasping for words. Pierce noticed it too. His smirk faltered, just slightly. J.D. Vance finally stood. The room held its breath. The air was electric, charged with the weight of an inevitable clash. "Professor Pierce," Vance began, his voice measured and steady, "you speak with great certainty about what science has supposedly eroded. But let me ask you this: has science answered the most fundamental questions of existence?" Pierce frowned slightly, caught off guard by the directness of the question. "You claim that science has removed the need for God," Vance continued, taking a step forward. "Yet for all our discoveries, we still do not know why the universe exists at all. We still do not understand the origin of consciousness, the precise nature of time, or why the universe operates under laws so finely tuned that the slightest variation would render life impossible." Pierce opened his mouth to respond, but Vance did not give him the chance. "And yet," the vice president pressed on, his voice carrying through the hall, "you dismiss faith as irrational while simultaneously believing that everything, life, morality, intelligence, love, came from nothing, with no purpose, no direction, no intelligence behind it. Tell me, Professor, which of us is truly making the greater leap of faith?" The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. The tide in the room was shifting, and Pierce knew it. The professor scoffed, straightening his posture. "That's just a God of the gaps argument," he shot back, regaining some of his earlier bravado. "Just because we don't have all the answers yet doesn't mean we insert a deity as a placeholder." J.D. Vance smiled. "Exactly," he said. "We don't have all the answers, and yet you insist, without evidence, that God cannot exist. Isn't that, in itself, a faith-based position?" Silence. For the first time, Pierce did not have an immediate retort. His fingers curled around the podium, his mind racing for a counterargument that would land with the same impact. The tension in the auditorium was palpable. J.D. Vance had been expected to falter, but instead he was turning the debate on its head. With measured steps, the vice president approached the center of the stage, facing Professor Pierce directly. The professor had started this confrontation with mockery and condescension, expecting Vance to struggle under the weight of academic scrutiny. But now, as the room sat in silence, eyes locked on the vice president, it was clear that Pierce had underestimated his opponent. "Professor Pierce," Vance began, his voice even but firm, "you've made a passionate case today, arguing that faith is outdated, that science has eroded the need for God, and that rational minds should reject belief entirely. But let's examine the foundation of your argument." Pierce, standing tall at the podium, folded his arms, his smirk returning. "By all means," he said, voice laced with amusement. Vance took another step forward, speaking to both the professor and the audience. "You claim that science has systematically replaced religious explanations over time. That's true, to a point. We now understand lightning is caused by atmospheric conditions, not the wrath of the gods. We know disease is caused by microbes, not curses. But tell me, Professor, has science explained why the universe exists at all? Pierce's smirk faltered just for a moment. You argue that belief in God is irrational, Vance continued, pressing forward. And yet you place absolute faith, and I use that word deliberately, in the idea that life emerged from non-life, that consciousness arose from mere chemical reactions, and that the universe's precise order and mathematical structure are purely coincidental. Pierce scoffed, shaking his head. That's a false equivalence. I don't place faith in science. Science is based on observable facts. Religion is based on ancient myths and wishful thinking. Vance nodded, his expression calm, almost amused. All right. Let's talk about facts then. Are you familiar with the fine-tuning argument? Pierce hesitated. The fine-tuning of the universe, the idea that physical constants are so precisely calibrated that life would be impossible if they were even slightly different, was a topic often brought up by theists. He had countered it before, but still he hadn't expected it here, not from J.D. Vance. Of course, Pierce said curtly. Good, Vance replied. Then you know that the gravitational constant, the strength of electromagnetism, and the properties of subatomic particles are so finely tuned that even the smallest deviation would make life impossible, not unlikely, impossible. The odds of this happening by chance? Infinitesimally small. Pierce waved a dismissive hand. That's just anthropic reasoning. We observe a universe that supports life because, well, we're here to observe it. That doesn't mean it was designed. Vance's expression remained unreadable. That's an interesting response, because what you're saying, essentially, is we got lucky. That's not a scientific explanation, Professor. That's a statement of faith. A murmur rippled through the audience. The students were paying attention now. Pierce stiffened. It's not faith. It's the acknowledgement that we don't yet have all the answers. Vance smiled. He had been waiting for that response. And that, he said, is exactly my point. He turned to the audience. Professor Pierce criticizes religious belief because, according to him, faith is just a way to explain what we don't understand. And yet, when confronted with gaps in knowledge, where did consciousness come from? Why does the universe follow precise mathematical laws? He doesn't have an answer. But instead of admitting that these mysteries might point to something beyond human comprehension, he does exactly what he accuses believers of doing. He assumes a future explanation will come, despite having no evidence for it today. Silence. Pierce's grip tightened around the podium. That's a God of the Gaps argument, he snapped. Just because we don't know something doesn't mean we should insert a deity as an explanation. Vance nodded. And just because we don't know doesn't mean we should assume no God exists. That's the contradiction in your position, Professor. You claim to champion reason, yet you make an absolute claim about something you cannot disprove. A true scientist acknowledges the limits of human knowledge. You, however, reject faith, not because of evidence, but because of assumption. Pierce opened his mouth, but no words came. He was trapped. J.D. Vance let the silence stretch. He could see it in the shifting expressions of the students, the growing uncertainty among those who had laughed earlier. They were thinking. And that, he knew, was the first crack in Pierce's once unshakable narrative. The silence in the auditorium was deafening. For the first time, Professor Jonathan Pierce was struggling for words. The once confident academic, who had ridiculed faith with effortless ease, now stood gripping the podium, his mind scrambling for a response that would restore his authority. Finally, Pierce scoffed, shaking his head. So, this is the game you're playing, he said, attempting to regain his footing. You twist words, you create illusions of contradiction. But at the end of the day, the facts remain. Science has explained far more about the world than religion ever has. Every time religion has claimed something as truth, science has dismantled it. J.D. Vance stepped forward, his gaze steady. Has it? Pierce frowned. What? You claim science has dismantled religious truth? Vance continued. Tell me, Professor, has science explained why consciousness exists? Why you and I are not just biochemical machines, but self-aware beings capable of love, morality, and reason? Has science explained the origin of life itself, or why the fundamental forces of the universe are so precisely balanced that the existence of life is even possible? Pierce stiffened. Those are gaps in our knowledge. Exactly, Vance interrupted smoothly. They are gaps. And yet you assume, on faith, that one day science will have all the answers. Tell me, Professor, is that not precisely what you accuse religious people of doing? Believing in something without conclusive evidence? The professor's face darkened. That's a false equivalence. No, Vance said firmly. It's the exact same thing. The only difference is that I acknowledge my faith, while you pretend yours doesn't exist. A ripple went through the audience. The tide was turning. Pierce's fingers clenched around the podium. His usual weapon of ridicule had failed him. The vice president was not just countering his arguments, he was exposing the contradictions in his thinking. All right, Pierce said, his voice tight, let's be clear about something. Science is based on evidence. Religion is based on blind belief. There is no evidence for God. None. J.D. Vance raised an eyebrow. No evidence? He gestured toward the audience. Then explain this. Why, despite all the scientific advancements you've mentioned, do billions of people, including some of the greatest minds in history, still find meaning, purpose, and profound truth in their relationship with God? Are they all deluded? Or could it be that you have dismissed something you don't fully understand? Pierce's face reddened. This is ridiculous, the professor snapped, his composure now visibly cracking. Faith is a crutch for people who are too weak to accept reality. It is an excuse for ignorance. A murmur of discomfort rippled through the auditorium. Even some of his supporters looked uneasy at his sudden loss of control. J.D. Vance, in contrast, remained poised. That's a convenient accusation, he said, his voice steady. But here's the truth, Professor. You are not angry at religion. You are angry at the idea that you might not be as in control of knowledge as you think. You ridicule faith not because it is weak, but because it challenges the illusion that human intellect alone can explain everything. Pierce opened his mouth, but no words came out. The room was deathly silent. Vance took another step forward. You speak of intelligence, yet you dismiss the wisdom of centuries simply because it does not fit your personal worldview. You claim to be an advocate for open-mindedness, yet you mock those who dare to think differently. So tell me, Professor, is it truly intelligence that drives you, or is it arrogance? Pierce's hands trembled slightly on the podium. His breath was shallow. He had never been challenged like this. And the worst part? He had no answer. A shift had occurred in the room, a shift no one had expected. The students who had once laughed at Pierce's mockery now sat in stunned silence. Many of them had come here believing that faith was the enemy of reason, but now they weren't so sure. The auditorium remained silent as J.D. Vance stepped away from the podium. The air was thick with realization. What had begun as a staged intellectual ambush had ended with the challenger exposed and the man of faith standing victorious. Not through anger, not through mockery, but through reason, humility, and unshakable conviction. Professor Pierce still stood at the front, gripping the podium. His usual dominance over the room was gone. His hands trembled slightly, his mind racing for a way to salvage the moment, but the truth was evident. He had no words left. As J.D. Vance returned to his seat, a single clap echoed through the hall, then another and another. Within seconds, the room erupted into thunderous applause. Some students who had once laughed at Pierce's jabs now sat deep in thought. Others, who had come to the event assuming faith was a relic of the past, now questioned what they had been so certain about. Pierce took a slow breath, his face pale. His entire career had been built on intellectual dominance, on ridiculing belief, yet today, in front of his own students, he had been confronted with an argument he couldn't dismiss, a challenge not just to his philosophy, but to his own arrogance. As the event ended and students gathered in groups, their discussions took on a different tone. The usual casual dismissal of faith was gone. Now there were genuine questions, honest curiosity. One student, a young woman who had previously cheered for Pierce, approached J.D. Vance. "Mr. Vice President," she said hesitantly, "I never thought I'd say this, but I think you gave me something to think about today." Vance smiled. "That's all I ever wanted." This wasn't just a debate. It was a moment that revealed something we often forget in today's world, that faith and reason are not enemies, that true wisdom isn't about silencing those who disagree with us, but about having the humility to question our own assumptions. We live in a time when belief is often ridiculed, when faith is dismissed as a sign of weakness. But what if the real weakness is the refusal to consider the possibility of something greater than ourselves? Now, I ask you, where do you stand? Do you believe faith and intellect can coexist, or do you think one must dominate the other? Let me know in the comments, and if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Let's keep this conversation going. God bless you, and God bless America.